Welcome back to Red Zone in the Lab podcast. I am Deuce, and today we have Mitch Tischler from the Beltway Football Podcast, formerly Washington Football Pod, as he gives us some insight into the third and fourth round pick Stromberg and Daniels. We also discuss Saahdiq Charles making this his year as an NFL player. Also, the state of the O-line. Mitch gives us his starting five and how EB impacts the team. Mitch drops a nugget about Wentz and Howell. Let's get into the other side of this.
This is Hog Farmer Chris and the 2022 Commanders Fan of the Year. Before you listen to Red Zone in the Lab podcast, I want to thank you for your support in bringing awareness to the Hog Farmers Charitable Foundation, which helps children and their families affected by pediatric cancer. You truly make a difference. And with that being said, please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube.
We're back! Welcome back to Red Zone in the Lab with Deuce.
Welcome to Red Zone in the Lab podcast. I am Deuce, and joining us today is Mitch Tischler. How are you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Deuce?
I'm doing good. Hanging tight. So, how's everything going on your end with the podcast with you guys, JP, P. Haley? It's such a joy. Y'all just had me cracking up, man. It's such a joy.
Yeah, things are good. We rebranded a little while ago. We're now Beltway Football Podcast, so having a little fun under there and doing our thing. We're excited that OTAs are back and we can talk about real football. Looks like the sales stuff eventually will be behind us, and we won't have to talk about winning off the field. We can hopefully talk about winning on the field.
Exactly. I mean, have we even had an off season? Have we even had a break since the Super Bowl? I don't think so. It's just news every day coming out of Commanders Park.
They're the NFL team that makes the most news the most consistently. It's unbelievable year after year. There's always big time things happening in the off season, and hopefully we're all moving beyond all that stuff.
Exactly. So today, Mitch, I kind of brought you in to kind of talk about the OTAs. You the guy I like to go into when it talks about the guys in the trenches. So I want to talk a little bit about them. But before we go there, going into the draft, where were you on if we needed to add depth to the offensive line, and how important did you think it was?
Quite frankly, I thought it was very important, and I was a little disappointed with the way the draft fell, and then also with what the Commanders did. I like the Emmanuel Forbes pick in the first round. Ultimately, none of those tackles that I think were, kind of those top four guys were available when the Commanders came to pick. So it made sense to go corner. They needed some help at corner. My issue was kind of in the second round. There were a bunch of especially interior O linemen that I thought could have been the guy that they could have taken there. And I think ultimately Quan Martin's going to be a good player. I think, he got picked. They picked him in a good spot, value-wise or whatever you want to look at it. But he was a little bit more of a luxury pick to me. And, this team isn't exactly in a position where they can make some, more luxurious picks. So I would have liked them to have gone O-line there in the second round. But they circled back and did touch on it in the third and fourth with, Ricky Stromberg and Braden Daniels. But ultimately, once you get out of that first round and, even most of that second round, when you start going third, fourth, and then day three guys, you end up, kind of with a little bit of a crapshoot. And, there's a lot of good things that you can look at on paper about, both Ricky Stromberg and Braden Daniels and kind of how they may fit into this offense and into this O-line. But to expect those guys to step in and help day one, I think would be a little optimistic. So, those guys are going to take a little bit of time to grow, I believe. And, hopefully down the road, they're able to break into the starting lineup. But ultimately, I thought they had a solid draft, but unspectacular. I would have liked to have seen them get a little more help earlier with the O-line.
And that's what I want to go to next with the O-line. I want to talk about Ricky Stromberg, center. Of course, he was the first lineman that was taking a lot of people was panicking. We went DB twice. They're like, wait a minute. But we end up in the third round going with Ricky Stromberg, center with pick 97. So far in rookie mini camps, of course, the OTAs. What can you tell us about him, and what is his projection looking like for this upcoming year?
I mean, it's really hard to say for minicamp and OTAs, especially for O linemen, when they're not in pads, they're not hitting, they're not, you're just kind of seeing them go through their sets and kind of getting their wind back ready, kind of to be in football shape. So it's a little tough to say. Certainly, the most recent OTA that we were at, you had Nick Gates getting the starting center snaps. You had Tyler Larson taking the second round center snaps, and really didn't see Ricky Stromberg take many snaps in either 7-on-7 or 11-on-11. Certainly part of that is you have Gates and Larson, who are both kind of veterans, so it makes sense that they would get those snaps early on. I thought we'd see a little more of Ricky Stromberg getting some work with some of the first string backups instead of dropping down to the third and fourth stringers. But ultimately, it kind of makes sense. And I think you can look a little bit at, Saahdiq Charles and kind of the way that he progressed, from, being a fourth round guard center or tackle / guard to finally this year, it seems like he's going to get his opportunity to start. You hope that Ricky Stromberg is able to make that move a little bit quicker and that the Commanders don't have the same injury attrition that they've had the past couple of years, especially at center. So, you hope that in, maybe next year, maybe 2 years from now, he can be your starting center. But I don't think this year you're going to see him overtake Nick Gates. I think he's going to be, the starting center there. And while Stromberg does have a little bit of positional flex at guard, he played there early in college. Ultimately, I think they look at him as a center, and that's where we're going to see him play, pending major injuries.
I'm sorry. I was there last Thursday, and to me, it seemed like Gates had this giddy up, and I know he had a couple surgeries on that leg. Have you seen that like throughout OTA, or was that just that one day? It just seems like I don't know. It's like somebody was telling me that that's a permanent limp or
Energy.
whatever it is. That yeah. So is that what that is? Because it looks uncomfortable. Like he can't sprint for screens and stuff like that.
Oh, you're
Did
saying?
You notice that?
It looks like he has a hitch in his giddy up when he's running.
Yeah, it's
around.
like a hitch. Yeah, like when he's running, like it's like I don't know.
I think it's a little early. I think it's a little early in camp. I think guys are still getting their legs back under them. What I noticed most from him was his energy, was his vocalness and calling the huddle. And I think kind of the combination of Nick Gates being kind of that old school center. I mean, I think about like when I was in high school, granted that was, 20 years ago, but like the center would always like run to the huddle, hold up his hand, huddle. Yeah, like you see that in like Pee Wee football, you see that in high school. I don't know that you really see it in big time college or the pros that much, but like Nick Gates was that guy. And I think it's a little bit the combination of his enthusiasm. Eric Bieniemy expects a lot from his guys, especially his leaders. I liked what I saw a lot from Nick Gates. Again, we're sitting there talking about, shorts and t-shirts, so it's hard to get a feel for how good he feels and how well he moves and, all those different things. So we'll get a better feel for that when we get to training camp and they're able to put on the helmets and really do a little hitting. But certainly as far as, energy and leadership, I liked what I saw from him in that sense.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit. You kind of mentioned Saahdiq Charles, and I think with Saahdiq Charles, this is going to his fourth year, which is his last year. He's also another one on a contract year, like two of our which I call absent OTAers, is also on contract years, and so is Saahdiq Charles. But he's really had an up and down career. I think year two, like he was getting into a groove, and then he ended up getting injured. I think it was real big for him to be there during Bieniemy's press introductory to be able to be there. It looks like he's going to be committed. It seems like he's coming out with the starters at left guard. Looking at Saahdiq over this off season, has anything looked different to him? Does he seem more engaged? Does it seem like he's really ready to give it his all? What's your take on Saahdiq Charles?
I never really thought the problem with Saahdiq was his buy-in or his engagement or his want to be there. Sometimes you get guys who don't love football and this, that, and the other thing. That was never really my feeling with Saahdiq. I think a little bit what happened with him is what I'm concerned about happening with Sam Cosmi on the other side, where they were tackles in college, and then they were kind of sold this bill of goods that they had this position flex and could play guard, and they kind of flip-flopped, between those two positions and never really were able to get comfortable. I think Saahdiq settled into that guard position over the last, kind of year and change. And, you hope that he is able to take that next step, because this offensive line is going to need him to. I talked about wanting to go in the second round with some of those interior O linemen. And particularly, I'm concerned about that left guard position. I imagine Andrew Norwell most likely is going to be a post-June 1 cut. So, coming up this week, we might hear, the end of his tenure here in DC. He's also wasn't at OTAs, was at home rehabbing an injury, so they say. But that left guard position is a tough, it's tough to be super confident about it between Saahdiq and Chris Paul, because you have two guys that haven't shown a whole lot in the NFL and honestly haven't necessarily showed a ton kind of in practices that I've been, overly impressed with. So hopefully, in this fourth year, as Saahdiq is now settled into a guard position, is not having to split his reps between, inside and outside, he's able to kind of, get in that rhythm and take the next step and be a reliable starting offensive lineman. But, that's to be seen. And considering some of the struggles that Charles Leno also had on the left side later in the year, I think was mostly due to injury, not necessarily, the fact that he's a bad tackle by any means. But that left side can be a little worrisome if Charles doesn't bounce back and have a better season, and if both Charles Leno and Saahdiq Charles don't bounce back and have better seasons and kind of take that next step, especially for the young kid.
Yeah, I'm really pulling for Saahdiq Charles. I really liked him coming out. I thought he was a guy that could catch on late, that could be like a future guard for us. But of course, like we kind of talked about, the injuries and those things kind of derailed him. And what I didn't know, because I wasn't really on Twitter a few years ago, Sam Fortigay did an interview, a one-on-one interview with him when I was talking to Sam last. He sent that over. So just knowing what he went through to get where he's at now, I'm really, really rooting for him to really pull over. But I am concerned at that left guard spot as well as you.
Before we get started with the podcast, I want you all to go check out You Grow Girl. That's Grow, Grow, written by a dear friend of mine, Jay Smith. It's for daily affirmations for Black women. It is filled with beautiful, colorful images of Black women and powerful affirmations. You can find it at amazon.com.
But the fourth round pick, 118, Braden Daniels, and he had a little controversy because people saw like the Trent Williams tag that he had in his Instagram handle. It's like, no, he loves Trent Williams. They come from the same place. He adored him. He's always had that. He's not saying he's going to be the next Trent Williams or anything, but it seems like he's also a project player in the sense like with Stromberg that we may not see this year. But what have you seen from Braden Daniels?
Yeah, first of all, huge personality, super nice guy, definitely kind of gregarious and out there, and I think that's kind of a fun personality to have on an offensive line, because normally those guys are really reserved and kind of in their own world. So getting a chance to talk to him a little bit was pretty cool just to see. He's another guy that they're going to look at as this tackle guard kind of duo here. I saw him taking most of his reps in OTAs at guard, but I believe he'll step out there a little bit on the outside to potentially, in case of injury, be able to step out there. But he's another guy that's going to be a project. He's not going to be a day one, plug and play player. And honestly, I don't know that there's really a spot that he would be a day one plug and play player. Really, when you look at that offensive line, the left guard spot's the only one that's really up in the air as to who the starter is going to be. It's pretty dead set with Leno, question at left guard, Gates center, Cosmi right guard, Wiley right tackle. It would take an injury, I think, to change any of those other four guys for who that starter is going to be. So, maybe Braden Daniels takes a big step in the next, 2-3 months. And when they get to training camp and, once you put on the pads and you start, hitting guys and blocking, the great thing about what's happening at the guard position, both with Cosmi and with whoever ends up starting on the left side, is they're facing two of the best D tackles in football every single day during minicamp and training camp and OTAs and all those different things. And so those guys are going to have an opportunity to practice blocking the best. And you're going to see, who has it and who doesn't, because both John Allen and Daron Payne are not guys that take reps off. They're not guys that take it easy when they're going against a second or third stringer. And they're also guys that will let you know when they, kick your butt in a one-on-one drill, but will also are guys that will pull you off to the side and, talk about, hey, you got to get a better punch, or your hand is too, whatever is happening there. So, really there's a lot that we can talk about with the O-line, but it's all kind of theoretical until we start seeing those guys, in space, in pads, actually be able to get their hands on one another.
Yeah, I'm really interested with the joint practices with the Ravens for those type 1-on-1 and 2-on-2 trenches. I know the fans are not allowed there, but is the media allowed at those joint practices?
Yeah, we'll be there. I believe it's August 15th and 16th in Baltimore. And listen, this is something that I've been yelling about for years, that this team needs to be doing more joint practices. I think there's so much more you can get out of joint practices than you can out of those preseason games.
Yeah, I'm right with you, Mitch.
You set up individual drills, you set up situations that might not come up in the course of a regular football game, and you can get your best on best. You can work your rookies in against the other team's first stringers, and also good to get kind of that competitive fire up. It's you do that a couple times during the preseason, and honestly, those preseason games, the starters aren't the most fiery group of guys, because it's they kind of know where they're at. There's dudes that are fighting for their jobs that get up like it's a regular season game, but kind of to stoke that competitive fire. You see guys how they're going to act and how they're going to react in uncomfortable situations against unfamiliar players. So I think it's a really, really good thing. Doing it with the Ravens is certainly an interesting take on it, because the Ravens are a organization that takes the preseason extremely seriously. They want to win those games. They love the win streak stuff. They love every bit of it. So I mean, it's gonna be a competitive, fiery couple of days, and it'll be fun to see how these guys react.
Yeah, I'm right with you. And just to kind of go sidestep a little bit, that's how I am with the quarterback competition. I just don't think, not just with us, but in today's NFL, how the practices are, how preseason games are all handled. I just don't see where you can have a legitimate quarterback competition unless you're counting the classroom. So that's why I think that these joint practices, I think they're way more important than the preseason games, because hey, I don't know, since we went to 3 games, I don't even know if starters even play in the preseason anymore. And you don't want your potential starting quarterback to be playing against fourth stringers that's really playing for their lives out there. That's going to really come, in the third and fourth quarter. But so I want to talk about Charles Leno a little bit, Mitch. For me, when it comes to Charles Leno, when you look at his numbers and you see where, if you want to look at PFF or his stats, or wherever you look at your numbers, you see he's a top 15 left tackle when you're looking at the numbers. It's just not so many left tackles that you can actually say is better than him. But just like Kendall Fuller, I think with them is when they get beat, they get beat real bad, and it leads into sack fumbles and touchdowns and all sorts of things. And that's what's kind of magnified when you're thinking about Charles Leno. But that's how I feel about Charles Leno. But he's there, he's there all the time. He may play through some nicks and injuries and stuff like that, but he's always there. So what's your take on Charles Leno?
Because there was no tackle available in the draft that was worth taking, I think you got to stick with Leno. Obviously, I mean, he's a veteran. He plays every game. He plays through a ton of stuff. There's not a better option out there. There's certainly not a better option on this roster, and I don't think there's a better option out there. So I think you're kind of in bed with Leno, and you're sticking with him. Since Charles Leno came here, he's essentially Morgan Moses, and I think he was a new face, and so folks were accepting and excited about him being here. But he's about the same level player that Morgan Moses was. A solid player that plays a ton of games, gets beat from time to time. certainly gets beat up as the season continues and looks for the extra edges that he can to, try and stay on the field and stay available. But he's not a great left tackle. And as we went into this draft, I was, pounding my fist on the table that you've got to get yourself kind of a staple left tackle. This organization had, Chris Samuels and then Trent Williams for the better part of 20 years. And so I think fans kind of, didn't value the offensive line as highly as I think need to, because you always had a guy like Trent there on the left side. And when you have a stalwart left tackle, you can then adjust the rest of your offensive line, and you can make adjustments for any other, faults that you may have. You can send running backs and tight ends to chip on the other side. You can shift the line to the right and leave, that left tackle, that stalwart left tackle there out on an island and be comfortable that, he's going to be able to cover the QB's backside. And so, Leno is not that guy, but he's a solid player. He's a veteran, and he's a guy that you can trust to be out there. And, I talked about the attrition kind of at the beginning on this offensive line as a whole, over the years. Nick Gates has played the same number of games the last 2 years as Chase Roullier. You can be excited about what Nick Gates brings, but you're ultimately hoping that he stays healthy. We haven't seen Saahdiq Charles play a full season. We've already seen him, have some injuries. Sam Cosmi, injured as well. Andrew Wiley, another guy who, plays a lot of games as well. So, I think you need some guys who you can reasonably expect are going to stay healthy for an entire season. And it's not the highest of praise in the world for Charles Leno, but, I think at this point in his career, he's done a very good job of, making himself an everyday NFL left tackle, and that's certainly nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on all those points. We got to let you go, but I have to ask you about Eric Bieniemy. Like, tell me about Eric Bieniemy, your impression of him, how he's been in practice compared to these past few years that you've been covering the team during OTAs. Now, we ain't even in training camp yet.
Right. We haven't even gotten into the high intensity stuff yet, right? Like, we're in the pads, we're in the t-shirt and shorts period, and you hear Bieniemy yelling all over the field, and I love it, because so often you have your offensive coaches are kind of, you're in control, they're always in the playbook, trying to figure out what's next, whatever. And it's the defensive guys that are always yapping, always yelling. DB's coaches are always the loudest guys on the field, and they're always talking trash. And I love listening to Bieniemy, yell at his guys. And whether it's Sam Howell or Jahan Dotson or Nick Gates or whoever it may be, he's on them. He's all up. He's all over them from, the second they walk out on the field until the time they leave. I was talking to Braden Daniels after the rookie mini camp, and he was talking about kind of the pace of practice and how high it was. And it's a legitimate difference that you can notice from, past years with, Ron and Jack Del Rio and, Scott Turner running these practices versus Eric Bieniemy being here now. And, Ron Rivera talked about him being the offensive coordinator, but also the associate head coach. And you're immediately seeing some of those changes that he's putting into this team and in this organization, into the practice schedule, into the way practices are run. There's differences across the board, and hopefully they're differences for the better. But certainly at minimum, I love the enthusiasm. I love the strength of his voice. You can hear him from 3 fields over. You're walking down to head to practice, and you already hear him, chewing somebody out for something. And I think he's going to keep everyone on their P's and Q's, and I'm excited for what he's going to bring to this offense. I think that, as much as I have some concerns as a whole for this offensive line, I think the Eric Bieniemy offense, with moving the pocket around a little bit and, getting Sam Howell on the move, will help kind of mediate any of those, some of those issues that might show up, with an offensive line that might not be, one of the top units in the league.
Man, I totally agree. It was like 3 straight drop passes when I was there last week, and he said, "Y'all can't get off my field, get off my field." He brought all the receivers out, and he switched. I said, "Man, I love it." But just one thing, Mitch, last year, I don't know if you noticed this, at training camp before the Ravens game, when they was running their plays preparing for the Ravens, I still saw Scott Turner in the huddle, like lifting the plays up behind them and going over them while they was in the huddle. And I noticed with Bieniemy, he's already calling plays from the sidelines.
Yeah, I don't think Turner was doing that. Certainly not with the starters.
Okay.
Usually when the coaches are in the huddle, they're showing that for when the scout offense is going against the starting defense, or vice versa. But certainly, they talk about learning a new offense and all the new language and all those different things. And just from what we're hearing on the sidelines, the verbiage is different than what we've heard in the past in terms of words they use for the different packages and whatnot. And the fact that he's able to call in these plays, and it's not the biggest thing in the world, but the fact that we're in May and June and Sam Howell knows the offense well enough that he's able to recall and call those plays without having an armband or a play sheet in front of him, that says something. I mean, that kid's putting in work, and I think the combination of Bieniemy's enthusiasm and excitement and attention to detail, and how Sam Howell's work ethic, I think is going to be kind of a fun little combination. And certainly we're looking at an OTA's mini camps, we're talking about it, but they seem further ahead than I would expect them to be at this point, considering that Bieniemy really just came here a couple months ago.
Yeah, that's why I said I'm taking from last year's OTAs, this year's OTAs, shorts and shirts. I'm not saying that these guys are going to be better because we don't know that yet. The equipment is not on, but I only can compare what I can compare.
Sam Howell throwing the football versus Carson Wentz last year is such a difference. We were just when they're running receiving, the receiving tree, Wentz wasn't particularly accurate, and we were kind of trying to figure out, like, was that Wentz? Was it the receivers? What the deal was. There's so much more detail oriented this year and so much more on point, and Howell's a better, more accurate quarterback than Wentz was showing us last year at this time. Let's just hope it translates to pads and translates to the season.
That is true. Mitch, where can we find you and the boys?
On Twitter, Instagram at Mitch_Tischler. And then, of course, the Beltway Football Podcast.
Yes, Mitch, thank you so much for joining us again. We have so much more to talk about. Hopefully you'll be available sometime in the summer. Hopefully we get a break before mandatory camps and nothing else pops up. Right. But again, thank you. Thank you to all of you for watching. Thank you for listening. This is Red Zone in the Lab Podcast. I am Deuce. One beat, one sound, one heart, one love.
Thank you for listening to Red Zone in the Lab Podcast. Please subscribe to YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Google, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Remember, do it because you love it, not because it loves you. One beat, one sound, one heart, one love.